Okay, let's get started. Today's the Rachel Carson lecture for the AGU Ocean Sciences section, and it's a very distinguished lecture for the excuse me, for cutting-edge research by a female ocean scientist, especially related to societal concerns, and very distinguished list of former presenters. See how to make this go forward. Rachel Carson was an American marine biologist, and she's authored many famous books, one of which was The Edge of the Sea, but she's remembered mostly for her Silent Spring, which was published in 1962. It was a controversial book. If you haven't read Merchants of Doubt, I urge you to do so. It has a nice section about that controversy with Rachel Carson and DDT. But it detailed the environmental damage caused by widespread use of chemical pesticides, and led to greater public awareness of the need to preserve and maintain our environment. So today's speaker is Adina Paytan from UC Santa Cruz. And there's a picture of Adina feeding a margarita, I guess, to a lobster. I don't know. She's very Adina was born and raised in Israel, and she was educated at the Hebrew University and the Weizmann Institute, and then came to Scripps, where she got her PhD in 1996, working on barite mechanisms and paleoproxies, and continued that as a postdoc, looking at seawater sulfur isotope record. She was on the faculty at Stanford for a few years, and now she's at the Institute of Marine Science at UC Santa Cruz. She's got a very strong and diverse research portfolio. It's so diverse I won't take time to tell you about it, but she has an excellent webpage that outlines all the outstanding things that she's done. And she was also a previous winner of our Ocean Science Early Career Award in 2004. So she's already expressed interest. Those of you sitting in the back, move up in the front, so she's not doing a lecture like at Santa Cruz. But otherwise, we'll let Adina come up and give her lecture.
Well, thank you, Jim and Lynn, for this nice introduction, and I want to thank the AGU Ocean Science Award Committee for selecting me to give this presentation, and to Mary Silver, Kate Mackey, and whoever else worked on this nomination and took the time to forward my name to do this, and of course, to all of you who, despite all of the conflicting various sessions that are, and cool science that is ongoing here, decided to come listen to my talk. It is, well, Jim took the list of people who gave this lecture before me. I just wanted to say that it's a great honor to follow the footsteps of the previous scientists that gave this lecture, and I'm humbled to be here. So, how do I go to my lecture? Oh. Now I need my talk. Yeah, I'm sorry. Yep. Sorry about that. So when I wrote the abstract for this talk, I decided that I would like to try and link my research to the legacy and the vision of Rachel Carson. So I decided to talk about addressing global environmental challenges through interdisciplinary biogeochemical research. The first part of it, environmental challenges, was relatively straightforward because I knew that Rachel Carson was she sparked the modern day environmental movement, and she advocated for environmental conservation. So that part of the title was almost trivial, but I also included interdisciplinary biogeochemical research. And the reason I did that is because this is how I define my research, and I wanted my research to be linked to the vision of Rachel Carson. This is, Jim mentioned my webpage. This is the opening. When you look for my webpage, this is what you see: biogeochemicals, biogeochemical lab and cycles and all of the interactions between the air and sea and land and sea and so on. And however, when I tried to look at Rachel Carson's books and writings and public lectures, I haven't found any mention of either biogeochemistry or interdisciplinary. And I was wondering about that, and I did a little bit of research, and I found that the first use of the word biogeochemistry was actually in 1938, at least according to the Webster Dictionary, and that was several years after Rachel Carson has already received her master's degree in zoology, so she didn't define her research in that way. However, when you look or read any of the things Rachel Carson wrote, she clearly talked a lot about connections in nature, about the complexity of nature and the interactions between people, the environment, and the natural processes that we see around us. So even though she hasn't used the words exactly biogeochemistry and interdisciplinary, as you can see here in an essay she wrote that she entitled Biological Sciences, but she wrote that for the National Council of Teachers of English, she said, "We cannot understand the problems that concern us in this, our particular moment of time, unless we first understand our environment and the forces that have made us what we are physically and mentally. As the frontiers of science expand, there is inevitably an increasing trend towards specialization in which all the mental faculties of a man or a group of men are brought to bear upon a single aspect of some problem. But there is fortunately a counter tendency which brings different specialists together to work in cooperation. Oceanographic expeditions commonly include biologists, chemists, physicists, geologists, and meteorologists. So diverse are the problems presented by one aspect of Earth's surface." So whoever reads that, I mean, it's clear that she was talking exactly about interdisciplinary biogeochemical research. And when we talk about, in my vision, biogeochemical research, we're talking about the interactions of the various spheres of the Earth system and studying these interactions and feedbacks between biological, geological, chemical, physical processes that operate on a broad range of timescales in the present day and other previous boundary conditions in the past. And by definition, this requires the contribution and knowledge of several disciplines to form a more holistic framework of interpretation. And again, I think that with this in mind, you can understand that it requires the contribution of many scientists. However, this is not usually what happens. For many, many years, for example, geologists have been studying processes controlling aeolian sediment transport. They understand how climate, vegetation, moisture, human impacts, and disturbance all contribute to mobilizing aeolian sediments. But typically, they don't worry about these sediments after they leave the ground. And that's where atmospheric scientists come in, and they study the chemical composition, reactivity, radiative properties, and transport of aerosols. But again, most atmospheric scientists do not move the next step and worry about what happened to these aerosols when they're deposited on land or in the ocean. That's where chemical oceanographers, physical oceanographers step in and study the solubility of particulates in the oceans, their speciation, their distribution. Physical oceanographers will study how turbulence and currents would impact how fast these particles will sink in the water, or how the solutes will be dispersed and transported in the ocean. And then The biologists, on the other hand, will or focus on how organisms utilize nutrients, what are the limiting nutrients, and how the various organisms are distributed along in different locations in the biogeography of our planet. And finally, climate scientists will look at how aerosols impact radiative properties and therefore climate, or how the biological pump may sequester carbon dioxide and impact climate, and then paleoceanographers would look at past records of these processes. But it's actually quite rare that all of these things are linked together into one framework. Most of the time, these different groups of people work independently in their various disciplines. This is one really nice example, in my opinion, where John Martin in 1998 actually took knowledge from these various distinct areas of research and tried to put them together into what's called the iron hypothesis. And basically what John Martin, who was a biological oceanographer interested in metal uptake and utilization by plankton, came up with is he knew that there's vast areas in the ocean where nutrients are not fully utilized. And he knew that these organisms may require iron to utilize the nutrients. So he speculated that if we add iron in these low nutrient, high chlorophyll regions of the ocean, we will increase productivity. And I don't have a, oh, I do have, sorry. So we will increase productivity. Increased production will sequester CO2 from the atmosphere, draw down CO2, and basically he proposed a mechanism for producing ice ages. And over here he took knowledge from the fact that there's dust that comes from land and that dust is rich in iron. Iron may limit productivity, which could sequester CO2. But if you think about this list or cycle of processes, there really was, it's always based on speculations. At that stage, not a single experiment has been done where anybody has taken actual aerosols or dust and found out whether it does or it doesn't end up in sequestering of CO2. But regardless, although controversial, this sparked a lot of he also related that to climate change by looking at an ice record that shows changes in dust deposition over time. Anyway, this sparked a lot of follow-up research where people did a fertilization experiment, really very detailed work of mapping trace metal distributions, looking at limiting nutrients for phytoplankton, and looking at remote sensing and optical thickness of dust distribution on the planet. Yet all of these different really nice projects that contributed a lot of knowledge, again, were within, for the most part, within distinct disciplines. And still, there was no connection between the various components of this story. And while we learned a lot, there were still a lot of things that were missing. Specifically, there was no direct demonstration of these impacts. So what we didn't know still is which components of aerosols affect the phytoplankton, both on the individual species level or the community level. Do all aerosols behave similarly? Do they induce the same impact? How do different taxa respond? And then how do other organisms beyond the first level of the food chain respond to these atmospheric depositions? And this is where my research and my group came in, but I somewhat took a different approach where I tried to involve a whole community of other scientists to work collaboratively in order to address this question and link together these various disciplines, bringing us back to interdisciplinary research. So what we did, we looked at different sites throughout the world, these red spots over here, that are characterized by different amounts of dust deposition and different ecosystem structure, from very high productivity, low dust, to high dust, high productivity, and so on. And also, each of these sites have distinct dust sources that could be different in composition. So in collaboration with atmospheric chemists, we installed aerosol samplers, collected aerosols directly at the location of where our studies were done, and looked at the concentration of aerosols, their composition, both in terms of nutrients and trace metals, their solubility, and so on. With atmospheric deposition modelers, we looked at the particle size and the meteorological and climate conditions to calculate actually the dry deposition fluxes of these various components. And with chemical oceanographers, we looked at the solubility of these various metals, nutrients in seawater, their distribution, did mass balance experiments to see what fraction of these trace metals are actually contributed by atmospheric deposition. And then with biologists, we looked both at in situ, mesocosm, laboratory, as well as genetic tools to kind of look at the various impacts of atmospheric deposition in various locations. And we observed different responses. This shows you some results from the Gulf of Aqaba, and you can see that if we add phosphorus or nitrogen alone, we cannot really induce any growth compared to the control. But if you add N and P together with or without iron, you do see growth. When you add dust with or without nitrogen and phosphorus, you also see growth or increase in chlorophyll, suggesting that atmospheric deposition here. Now I call it dust, but these are actually aerosols collected at the site where we did the experiments. We see that that did contribute to growth. In coastal California, we found that nitrate is limiting growth and that aerosols contribute some nitrogen even in this coastal upwelling region, while in Barbados, phosphorus, at least in some months of the year, was the limiting nutrients, and aerosols contributed some phosphorus, yet not a lot because the phosphorus to nitrogen ratios in aerosols is fairly low. In Bermuda, we found that different dusts induce different responses. While one dust composition resulted in a lot of growth, the other dust looked like iron, nitrogen, and phosphorus additions, suggesting that at least some dust has another component that is not always present that causes even more growth. And we also saw that different groups of organisms respond differently to the same additions. Surprisingly, we found that dust doesn't always induce growth, and in some cases, adding certain dust causes a decline or a crash of the phytoplankton, and following by knowing what's the composition in our specific growth incubation experiments and in our samples, we followed with additions of various metals and speculated that we're seeing metal toxicity, or specifically copper toxicity response in these experiments. Then in collaboration with atmospheric modelers, we modeled the copper deposition fields in the globe, and as well as we coupled copper deposition with chlorophyll distribution fields to look at where we would anticipate toxicity in the natural environment. So again, what I'm trying to show here, that each of these things was done in collaboration with people that were specialists or experts within various fields. We saw again that different organisms respond differently also to toxicity, not only to fertilization. So we found a lot of new scientific insights, specifically that while aerosols have profound effects on both chemistry, biology, cycling of nutrients, and possibly climate, we didn't get that far down the sequence of research, but certainly not all aerosols are created equal, and not all organisms respond equally to the same aerosols. So this is new insight, but mostly I think what's interesting is the new scientific approach, or the different scientific approach, which involved contribution from many specialists. And again, looking at Rachel Carson's views in a talk that she gave to the Kaiser Foundation in '63, she said, to solve these problems, we need, it is true, the service of many specialists, each concerned with some particular facet, but we also need to see the problem as a whole. And I think with that approach, you can have a change in paradigm, or what the National Science Foundation calls transformative science, because our initial ideas of when we start or think about the problem change. And now we know that dust is not only iron. Dust can be a lot of different things. And dust can indeed enhance primary production in some site at some times, but not always and not all the time. And the response is different depending on which organism is in the water column and what season in the year you're doing the experiment. We really don't know what happens further down the food chain or the food web, because primary production does not equate to organic carbon flux to depth. And therefore, we still don't know what the impact on CO2 or the biological pump, and therefore climate, would be if we add dust into the ocean. It's not a dust equals ice age necessarily. So there is still a lot to learn here, and indeed this research sparked a lot of similar experiments throughout the world and different models that are incorporating. And in my lab right now, we're trying to look at this part now to see if dust can or will induce actually transport of organic carbon to depth or not, and this research is ongoing. But I put a big question mark here on the CO2, because this is something that we still do not know, the impact of atmospheric deposition on climate. And as I was reading Rachel Carson's lectures and talks, I found out, I was actually very surprised to find out that Rachel Carson in 1950, in her book, The Sea Around Us, the chapter on the global thermostat, already recognized global warming. I want to remind you that 1950 is before Charles Keeling started measuring the Keeling curve in Hawaii. And she already then said, but for the present, the evidence that the top of the world is growing warmer is to be found on every hand. The recession of the northern glaciers is going on at such a rate that many smaller ones have already disappeared. If the present rate of melting continues, others will follow soon. So that's an insight that if somebody had written it today would be totally appropriate. This is in 1950. And because we are talking about CO2, I thought I will share a couple of other research, interdisciplinary research projects that are ongoing in my lab that are trying to look at the impacts of different greenhouse gases in different locations. And over here, one of the projects, again, which is interdisciplinary, looks at coral calcification in a high CO2 world. And as you know, a large fraction of the CO2 that is in the atmosphere dissolves in the ocean, resulting in ocean acidification. Our study site in Mexico involves the submarine groundwater discharge sites or springs that you can see over here. And the nice part of this, these sites or springs is that actually there is mixing between seawater and groundwater, meteoric groundwater, in the aquifer before discharge. So the waters that discharge are actually have salinities that are very similar to seawater. So together with geologists and hydrogeologists, we did a lot of research on the discharge and the function of these submarine springs, and physical and chemical oceanographers. We're mapping the composition of this water. We're also collaborating with scientists that develop instrumentation to continuously measure the pH and salinity and oxygen, and we even deployed osmosamplers to collect water continuously at these sites. So again, community effort to characterize this site. And of course, with ecologists and coral physiologists, we try to look at the organisms that live around these springs. You can see here the blue areas over here are low pH, undersaturated sites, and you can see that there's corals growing and calcifying at undersaturated conditions at these locations, which is quite surprising because most of the predictions indicate that corals will stop calcifying even when aragonite saturation reaches 2.5 or so. So that's a very interesting site. However, it's not all good news. Although some corals do calcify, the number of corals in these springs is much less, only 3 compared to 10 corals in the outer reef. Their coral cover and the number of individual coral colonies is lower at the springs. But yet, some corals can calcify. If you look at the extension rate, density, and calcification rate, you can see that the rate of calcifying also drops close to these springs. And most importantly, if you look at the cores here, this is a core outside the spring in a control environment at the same location, about 5 meters apart, and this one is at the spring, and you can see all of these borings and holes. Because the density of carbonate that is precipitated is low, these corals are more susceptible to boring, and therefore the coral framework that they're building is more fragile and may be more susceptible to storms. So while some corals can grow there, they don't grow as not all the coral species grow, and they don't calcify and produce such strong reef structures. And we also compared these growth rates from the field to lab experiments and saw that there is a very good correspondence. So our conclusion was that while corals grew, they did not fully acclimate to these conditions, and ongoing work, and this time in collaboration with molecular biologists, coral genome expert, and as well as experts on coralline algae and benthic forams, we're trying to look at the mechanisms that allow certain corals to acclimate and adapt to these conditions. We formed a transplantation experiment where we took different species of corals and transplanted them in the in these springs, outside the springs, and we're looking at their acclimation growth and particularly what genes they're expressing in order to be able to acclimate there. We're looking at recruitment of coralline algae and adaptations of foraminifera to these sites as well. In addition to all of these scientific collaborations, the work in our lab is now expanding to collaborate also with decision-making scientists and to look at social adaptation and building governance through the Belmont Forum collaboration and the coastal seas. So we're moving into expanding our array of collaborative research beyond the physical sciences and biological sciences, also to policy and decision making. Another interdisciplinary biogeochemical work that we're doing takes us far from the tropics and the corals into the Arctic, and not CO2 now, but methane, another greenhouse gas. And over here we're looking at the groundwater flow induced methane inputs into lakes in the coastal system. Basically, as the permafrost in the Arctic is melting, the water cycle is being moving faster, there's more groundwater flow, and this groundwater transports methane to coastal environments and lakes, from which it goes back into the atmosphere. And because it's a greenhouse gas, it induces a positive feedback, increasing further permafrost melt and so on. And this work, again, is in collaborations with radiochemists, hydrogeologists, as well as isotope geochemists that are helping map methane in the lakes, map permafrost depth, permafrost processes, and we're finding lovely correlations between groundwater, isotope tracers, and methane, showing that indeed this mechanism of methane transport through groundwater into coastal environments and aquatic system is viable, it's happening, and mass balance calculations shows that the amount of methane transported this way can account for all of the flux that we're measuring, the flux from lakes into the atmosphere. So it's not a negligible process. And again, we don't know why these slopes vary at different locations, and that's ongoing process, research to try and look at the impacts of vegetation, topography, permafrost depth, temperatures, and so on. And again, in collaborations with ecosystem modelers and remote sensing, GIS groups, in order to try and understand, and terrestrial ecologists, in order to understand these relationships. And finally, on a totally different time scale, work looking at probably the most recent large or fast input of greenhouse gases into the atmosphere 55 million years ago at the PETM, or Paleocene-Eocene thermal maximum. At that time, it was a warm period, probably with higher CO2 in the atmosphere. And what we have been doing in my lab is trying to reconstruct the strength of the biological pump or export production to see the response of export production or productivity to these perturbations. And we mapped using barite accumulation rate before the PETM and during the PETM, the distribution of barite accumulation, which we translate to export production. And you can see that productivity, or actually not primary productivity, but export production, the transport of carbon from the surface into mid-water depth, where it can get oxidized through respiration, increased significantly. We're tying this with present-day work looking at the impact of ocean acidification and temperature on the biological pump through mesocosms, and linking all this into a global model to try and understand the responses of the biological pump to future ocean perturbations. So, with all of this in mind, again, I want to go back to Rachel Carson and read something she wrote at a presentation that she gave in 1953 to the AAAS. Now our climate is changing, and we are moving into a warm cycle of unknown duration. Records of winter temperature of the Gulf of Maine show an impressive rise. It is not surprising that such a change in the oceanic climate should have caused many shifts in the distribution among marine fauna. With warmer temperatures, the sea herring is becoming scarce in Maine. So basically, what we are trying to do here, looking at the bigger picture, has impacts also on people and on us, and that's a message that Rachel Carson was very inspiring and forthcoming in seeing many years before we are all started going to AGU. I think probably there's very few people in this room that went to AGU in '53. Good. Okay, so I just have a couple of last slides to share some other inspirations or intuitions that Rachel Carson had about global climate change. She wrote to her friend Dorothy Freeman, "What has taken centuries to develop is being destroyed in a few years." And basically talking about human impacts on the environment and on climate. And my goal in this talk was to show you that if you work in an interdisciplinary way with many scientists and bringing together the insight from many disciplines, you can make changes. This map over here shows you the citation, cross-citation map of different journals, and you can see they're still clustered in groups with color. There's very few connections between the different disciplines over here. I think if we work together, this should all look like a scattered array of colors and not a spiral moving from one area to the other with very few connections. I want to emphasize that I'm not trying to say that there is no need for specialists. I work with a lot of specialists. I think we do need people that are experts in their field and are highly specialized in an area. But I also want to say that seeing the bigger pictures and looking beyond the confinements of the old school disciplines is also an exciting alternative, and we need to include both these approaches when we're doing our science and moving ahead with our science. And because this is what I do, obviously all of my research depends on other people that are contributing from many, many disciplines. And I just tried, there's no way I could thank everybody who contributed to my science. So what I did, in order to not pick and choose, I only put over here pictures of people that have published with me on projects that originated in my lab, or people that are currently working on joint funded project in my lab. And you can see, if you identify yourself here, great. And if not, you can see that there's many, many people. I'm sure everyone here at least recognizes one person in this group over here. They spanned scientists from multiple disciplines. I did not include any person that directly worked in my lab because they deserve a special slide for their own, because I was, and I am, lucky to have worked with many wonderful young scientists from which I learn a lot and enjoy working with them. They're a fun group of people, and also Ron and Tali down here. And I thank them for giving me this opportunity to do this fun and exciting research, for me at least. So one last slide for Rachel, and I want to thank Debbie for taking this picture of a statue of Rachel Carson at Woods Hole, because that is where Rachel Carson was introduced to ocean science and loved the sea and the inspiration that the sea gave her. And with that, I will be happy to answer any questions you have.
Time for a couple of questions?
Sue? Well, that's a great question. I actually thought a lot about that, and I think, you know, right now, in my opinion, and it's not founded by strong research, what's the limiting factor is not publishing in journals or getting funding, but rather the structure of university departments. And there was actually a nice paper published in EOS just last year that tried to interview various scientists, young scientists from the discourse program, who tried to address this question. And what they found, or what they concluded, is what prevents young scientists to do, whether it's real or perceived, what prevents young scientists for trying to do more interdisciplinary research and working on broad questions is the structure of the departments in universities. The fact that at the end they're going to get tenure from a various department, and they would be asked to be a specialist and contribute to one field. And that's what is scaring them. And I can't say that it's not founded based on my personal experience. Yes.
Hi, Ariana Stettin-Greer, NOAA. Basically, you just answered my question, which was that it feels as if interdisciplinary work is encouraged, and then you get to the point where somebody says, oh yes, but you still have to be judged by this certain set of criteria. So do you have thoughts on, I mean, I understand the constraints within academia. You have to be able to judge the merits of someone's work. How could we develop some way to judge interdisciplinary work and have that be, someone like yourself could easily judge people in a number of different fields and how effective they were being, but how do we put together those kinds of panels in an academic setting?
So I think there are many people that can judge good science, regardless of the field of where they are. I think it has to be a change in attitude of what is considered rigorous science. And if what you're looking for is an impact in a field, and you're defining a field narrowly, then you're not going to necessarily find that in an interdisciplinary scientist. If you're going to look for impact, and you can count impact by number of papers, H factor, number of grants, whatever you want. It's the same bean counting or not. I personally don't like the bean counting, although that is one metrics of doing that. But it doesn't matter if it goes into one field or a broader field. And I think the impact has to be the scientific question that you are trying to address and how you approached it, as opposed to tackling one small aspect of it. I think it's not necessarily that you can't publish within a discipline, but I think that there has to be within departments a way to evaluate or a way to appreciate contributions that are across disciplines. And it's not easy, but there are examples of departments that do that. There are schools, I know personally of in the UK where they got rid of departments and instead they're working in working groups. So they bring together scientists from multiple departments and they're working on a topic or on a project. And NSF's funding structure is moving towards that way. There's a lot of interdisciplinary calls for bringing scientists together to work with each other. I think the younger generation is more open to that. I think as time goes, I hope that things will change and that we will be more open to that. Yeah.
One follow-up to it, I think interdisciplinary work can sometimes take longer to do. You have to learn other people's jargon. You have to all be able to speak a common language. Projects can just take that much longer to get off the ground because they're a little bit more complicated. So I think it can be really hard to figure out what should those criteria be for judging someone who's doing interdisciplinary work, because it might not be the same number of grants or number of publications.
Absolutely. Or a paper where you have five other collaborators that are scientists in different fields. So again, I think these criteria need to be changed and the attitudes need to be changed. I don't think we, the interdisciplinary scientists, should change. I think the structure of the universities should change to accommodate that, because that's where we need to be moving in order to solve the problems of the 21st century.
So my question is, how does a student start collaboration with a interdisciplinary, like in different fields, right?
Okay, I can have one of my students answer that. No, basically, when a student wants to do interdisciplinary research, and I think that it's a good idea as their mentor or advisor, I tell them, find who's the expert in the field, look, do searches, find who you want to collaborate with, and send them an email. And 99% of the time, these people respond and come work with us and are happy to work with us. Similarly, when people from anywhere on this planet email me and want to come visit my lab, work with me, I'm open-minded. So students are encouraged to do that, I think. In fact, I don't write these emails. I ask my students to do that because I think the scientists will appreciate a student that has the initiative and the motivation to forward their own research.
Thank you.
Yes.
How did you get started down this path?
No, that's a good question. I mean, to be honest, it's because I never knew what I wanted to do when I grow up. Maybe it's because I never grew up. No, I'm curious and I like to do different. If I had to do the same thing over and over and over, I would be bored to death. So because of my own limitations and my own curiosity, I like working with other people because it's an opportunity for me to learn. So this way, I think it's fun. And I do not say that everybody has to be that way. I'm just trying to advocate openness to accepting that this is also one additional way of doing science. Okay, thank you.
Before you leave, let's give Adina her award so you can frame it and show her future students. And let's give her a good hand for this award.